Okay, so this video right here in particular is about the color rendering straight out of the camera on a Fuji or a Sony body. And the reason why I picked these two particular ones is because first, Sony gets a lot of flack for the color rendition. Some people say it's not good on skin tone. Some people say it's greenish and whatever weird hues going on. And a lot of people on the other hand say Fuji has a lot of great colors coming straight out of the camera. So I just wanted to show you, not saying that if you post process you can't get different or better or more accurate or similar results. We're just talking strictly straight out of the camera. Now keep in mind the lens choice, the sensor, the profile you may pick, and especially white balance all plays a major factor in how the color renders straight out of the camera. So I'm just going to do some basic examples and show you for demonstration purposes how it will render if you pick the white balance as a specific setting, and also how it renders with the auto white balance. Now for this particular setup, I didn't pre-plan to do this, so I didn't shoot with the same exact lens or swap FD lenses between the two because I can't do it any other way that I'm aware of in my situation. But just take it for what it is and look at it how it renders and the reason why it could shift for different reasons, and you can make your own judgment. This isn't to push you towards Sony. This isn't to push you towards Fuji. It's more or less about if you have one or the other, maybe be content with what you have and not feel the need to necessarily just jump ship strictly due to what you hear about the color only straight out of the camera, unless this plays a huge factor in your workflow. Not saying that none of those things are true, but just to kind of give you an oversight and a visual perspective of how it may look. And then once you understand the weak points of anything that you use, you adjust to it and you maneuver around it and you have a workaround. And that's pretty much it. And so the way I'm going to try to make this as normal and realistic as possible is put them in their both standard style profiles. Now Sony has, theirs is called standard, and while you have Fuji, theirs is called Provia standard. Now for both manufacturers, this is how they categorize or interpret what they consider a normal look. Now I didn't, like I said earlier, I didn't plan on making this comparison, so I'm kind of trying to pull things together so they make sense. So if you look at this one, by first look, I kind of like the one on the left a little bit better. It has a very punchy, kind of contrasty, kind of reminds me of how Canon looks out the camera if you're using maybe a Zeiss or a Sigma Art type of lens. Very heavy micro contrast. It just looks nice to me. So just keep in mind that the Sony on the left does have an artificial main light source, while the Fuji picture on the right is only lit by the sun. Now, if I used an artificial light source added to the sun on the Fuji picture, the colors would pop a little different and look a little bit better, but I didn't plan on making this video, so I'm grabbing stills from things I was already shooting. And later on, I will show you, to be fair, how they render differently with different scenarios, different white balance settings, as best as I could with the information that I already or only have at the moment. All right, so if you look at these two images, this is from Fuji, both of them. The one on the left is auto white balance. Now, auto white balance usually will pick the most obvious. And the thing about it is this particular day was very sunny, no cloud, no overcast, shade, nothing, super sunny, direct harsh lighting actually. So with that being said, I would think that the camera would automatically default to the sunny profile, but it didn't, because when I put the image, this is a straight out of the camera JPEG on the left. When I put up the raw file, it looked exactly the same, and I use Lightroom because they share the profiles for the Provia standard and all the different profiles that they have inside the camera. And they appear, I did a lot of tests on this when I first got the camera, and they appear to be pretty accurate to the JPEG. So with that being said, I didn't, besides putting it back on Provia standard because it defaults to Adobe standard, it matched the image on the left as far as I could see. And what I did, the only thing that I changed after rendering it out to a JPEG was adjusting the white balance temperature to a fixed sunny or daylight temperature. And as soon as I did, you can see it popped a little more. It's a little more saturated, a little more colorful, and to be honest, that's a little more what I remember it being true to eye. So the way it rendered it on the left looks a little more muted. I thought it had something to do with this the Canon FD lens, because it kind of has more of a softer, flatter color profile, and I thought that had something to do with the older lens, but Apparently not, or maybe it had something to do with the way it rendered white balance. I'm not really sure, but at the end of the day, that's how all the white balance rendered out of the camera, and the one on the right is how it rendered when I put a specific white balance. All right, so this example here is both of them straight out of the camera. The Fuji's on the right, the Sony's on the left. Now, we already saw in the previous example that Fuji does a pretty good job in auto white balance to get you at least in the ballpark of accuracy. It's not 100%, but it's very close and it's consistent. Now, the Sony, on the other hand, on the left side, a lot of people seem to say that it's inconsistent, and they get you hear a lot of greenish or maybe bluish hues or tones in the skin tones that aren't pleasing to a lot of people in photography, especially. With that being said, I'm kind of having a little bit of an opposite dilemma where mine kind of has a bad hue of red. It's not the same type of red boost that you find in maybe like a Canon or something like that where it's pleasing to the skin. This red is a certain hue of red that is not pleasing to any type of skin, light or darker complexions alike. It just looks bad. It kind of reminds me of a shade of barbecue sauce that you put on a grill or something. It's just not good. And even when I put a specific Kelvin temperature, I seem to still notice it, even if it's in small amounts. You may not notice it at first, but if anybody's out there who's ever dealt with white balance issues, you can have a white balance that is kind of tinted in the blue a little bit, and you can't really tell that the blue is there until you see a white that is with less blue, and then you'll obviously notice it and you can't unsee it after that. So with that being said, this can be corrected. You can take some of the saturation out of that hue of red in post without a problem, but like I said, this is about straight out of the camera and not about post-processing necessarily. So, and another thing I wanted to say about Sony and the Fuji as far as coloring goes, make sure you, especially if you're worried about straight out of the camera, because exposure is very important. I noticed with something like almost anything other than Sony, to be honest, if you underexpose the colors, I mean, not drastically, but maybe a stop or something like that, or a 2/3 or a third or whatever, it's not that everything shifts, it's just the exposure is darker, right? With Sony, I noticed that if you underexpose, the mid-tone gets kind of ugly as far as not just exposure, but especially in color, at least in my experiences. Now, I know if you do want to post-process, you can boost the shadows, but as everyone who does post-processing, if you boost too much of the shadow detail or the mid-tone detail, it kind of, if you overdo it, it's going to look too artificial and it looks kind of like a fake HDR look. Now, if that's what you're going for and you think that looks good or pleasing to you, then by all means, keep going for it. Now, you may be able to do this with landscapes or some landscapes or product photography, but specifically in portraits for skin tones, I think when you have to boost the shadow too much or recover a lot of those lost midtones, it looks pretty ugly. Okay, so here's a friendly reminder that both cameras are still and will be set to their standard picture profiles unless I state otherwise. Okay, so this is the same setup that you just saw. Fuji's on the right. It's pretty much in the ballpark of accuracy as far as white balance and color is concerned. And if you look at the left, it's the Sony. It's the same Sony image. The other one was straight out of the camera JPEG. And this one, I took the raw image so I can adjust the white balance only in Adobe Camera Raw. I didn't touch anything else. All I did was put all the white balance and take that off and put the preset for daylight. Now, that alone put the skin tones in the same ballpark. Maybe not exactly the same as the Fuji, but it's in the same ballpark. The only thing I noticed is that it may ever so slightly have a slight green cast to the overall image that a lot of people complain about the Sonys sometimes. And it's so faint that you may not really notice it. And I notice it more because I'm comparing it to the Fuji beside it. And you may not notice it on YouTube, but it is kind of there a little bit. So the only other thing that I notice is it could be due to the better dynamic range of the Sony that the black sports bra doesn't look very black. It kind of has a lot of, I guess, more detail in the black range. That could be it. So what I'm going to do, and you're going to notice in a second, I'm going to take that same image, adjust the white balance to daylight as well, and then I'm going to render the JPEG. But after, I just adjust the shadow slider only until the blacks look a little more black. I'm not going to crush the blacks, but just make them look black to my eyes. So when you look at this now, it definitely punched the black up a bit. And the reason why I did that is not for the black, it's because I wanted to see how it possibly may affected the skin tone, hue or shade of it or anything. So now when I look at it, it kind of gives me a better idea of how it may look. Now, keep in mind, this is close in the ballpark, more than before, but this is requiring a couple extra steps. And I'm making this video not for those who care to, if you're a post processor and you're using color checkers for accuracy for product photography, you already know that you have to make accurate colors regardless, and you're not going to depend on the color that comes straight out of the camera anyway for clients that require that. But if you're a type of person who likes to edit and you're going to do it anyway, or you're not, this is just to be aware of the steps you might or may not have to take in order to get color that you want to get, at least in the ballpark of what you would consider accurate. All right, so if you made it with me this far, it's around 11 minutes or so. You're probably thinking this seems more like an auto white balance situation than a color rendering situation through the sensors of the manufacturer. So I just kind of want to remind you that, you know, it's still one of the factors that play a part in how your colors get rendered, especially if you're doing straight out of the camera work. One of the things with Sony especially is that it's so forward in technology and is groundbreaking with a lot of the things that they do a lot of things for you. And when you see technology features like that in any device, you tend to let it do those things and you believe that it's going to be accurate because of technology. I do agree with that, but at the same time, I think this particular thing that it does for you is just not that accurate and reliable, or it's not that consistent enough where I would rely on it personally. So if you're going to white balance, just do like old school and white balance for the main light source that you see. Plus, when you go to edit, you'll see in batches, if there is light shifting outside especially, you'll see it in groups and you'll be able to adjust accordingly versus putting in auto where it's all over the place and you're going to have a tough time auto white or white balancing correctly a session unless you shot a target prior to the shoot. So now one nice feature about the Sony is that while you're previewing live, you can go through the white balance and you can kind of see and judge how things look to you by eye. So far with Fuji, I haven't had the chance to use it with any artificial light setups, and hopefully the high-speed sync triggers will be here this week at the time of making this video, or maybe next week, or hopefully it comes in. I'll be really excited about that, and I'll make a video probably on that just to keep anybody aware on the Fuji side that that high-speed sync stuff is coming. So if that was a reason why you didn't want to get it for those options, then I mean they're gonna close that gap as well, and then you just pick the right tool for the job, whether it be Sony or Fuji. And I made a video about that and why I have both also. So back to this coloring stuff. In a second, I'm gonna show you different images that you're not gonna notice the Sony problems in these images. It seemed like the auto white balance did a decent job. But with that being said, like I said, I don't think it's that consistent enough where I would use it. But to double down on that, I wanted to kind of talk about this. You may not notice the issues. They still actually may be there, but you just may not notice them because skin tones seem to be very specific, hue or shade of color, tone. I'm not really sure because every manufacturer out of the camera has their own way of rendering color, right? And usually the way that I judge it is not by landscapes, architecture, or products. I judge it by how it renders skin tones, all shades. And you'll notice between all the manufacturers that they all render them slightly different. Now, a lot of people say they love how the color space for Canon is. It has like, it boosts in the red tones. Now, it boosts in the red, but it's a certain hue of red that's very pleasing to most skin tones. The issue that I showed you with my Sony earlier, it was in the reds, but it was the wrong hue of red and it looked awful in any skin tone. Now, the Fuji, to me, in their standard profile, it looks pretty normal, or kind of maybe what I would expect from someone somewhat like a Canon style or whatever it is. Now, when I look at the Fuji, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty accurate. Nothing like ooh and ah, but it looks good. It doesn't look wrong, put it that way, when I look at it. So the reason I say this is because if you are mainly a portrait shooter, don't look at landscape pictures and say, wow, these colors are great and I think this is going to be the camera for me, because those things may not show up shooting landscape versus portraits, just like I'm gonna show you when I take pictures of these little Lego pieces. You're not gonna say, wow, the reds or that ugly red hue that Sean talked about is in this image. It's not in there. I don't see it at all. And the reason is because I think it's a very, very specific pinpoint type of hue of color that is affected by the skin tones or most general skin tones. And you only see it a lot of times when you see skin tones. And so for me, if I shoot people, I always want to see how it renders skin tones. And you got to be careful, because when you look at pictures online of how photographers show examples of portraits, a lot of times people, it's not just color correcting, they're actually color grading or a form of color grading, and they're adjusting things and they're making it look a certain way. So you're not getting a true representation of what it may or may not look like straight out of the camera. So just be aware of that. That's kind of what I was trying to show you today. Nothing's edited, nothing was color corrected, nothing was color graded. The only thing that I did was adjust the white balance on the images I showed you, or showed you straight out of the camera, and adjusted the shadow on that one particular image. So here's the images I was talking about on the Fuji and the Sony. Fuji's on the left, Sony's on the right. They're both in their native ISO. A lot of people say this, the Fuji's ISO is wrong. So I did both, 100 ISO on the Sony and 200 ISO. You can see that the Sony is clearly brighter with the same lens, same exact setup, same everything. It looks like a good third or 2/3 brighter for some strange reason. But then this is a crop version of, you can put it in crop mode. It apparently doesn't affect the quality, just pre-crops like you would in post. But I noticed in crop mode that, I could be wrong, but I noticed in crop mode that it looks a little more contrasty, or maybe you lose a little bit of dynamic range for some reason, even though that doesn't make sense if it's just a post crop. So I'm doing that for framing purposes, just so you can kind of get a better view and look at the colors. So in here, I don't see a funny red hue in the Sony side. It looks a little more lively, maybe because, and that's another thing. So people tend to go for the brighter image, the louder sound, and they think it sounds better, or the brighter color looks better. But even aside from the brightness, just looking at it, I personally kind of like the Sony. It just the yellow looks a little more, it just doesn't look as muted. I don't really think it's the fact of one being brighter. It's just a different shade or hue of yellow that looks better to me. So if you look at the red brick, there are definitely different tones of red, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier with the skin tones. They render red differently. All right, so let me just wrap this up. The Sony auto white balance is not very consistent, and that's one of the biggest issues in my personal experience, especially on how that white balance shift affects the skin tone specifically. It's not even consistent at being bad at a specific temperature. It's kind of iffy. You could take maybe 5 shots and maybe all 5 could have a slightly different shift, and that's a problem for me personally. Fuji, I don't notice that at all. It's always within the same ballpark. White balance plays a big part, but it's not the only part. There still is a different color science between the two brands. You know, if you look at the natural light stuff, the Fuji definitely looks night and day compared to the Sony. Even after I corrected it, it still looks better than the Sony to me. And better meaning not aesthetically pleasing better. It looks more accurate better, and that's important. So, and plus with the Sony, you may or may not have to take those extra couple little steps to make it at least somewhere close to the same ballpark as the Fuji. And I think you should be doing that anyway, but if you don't want to and you don't have the time for whatever the reason, yeah, you may get a lot more consistent results with the Fuji. But look at the examples and make your own judgment call what's best for your situation and your purposes. If this was helpful at all, please hit like and subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification icon to get future updates on future videos, or visit www.howtoandreviews.com. Till next time.